With that, I'm delighted to introduce to you Jeff Saunders, who will be moderating our first panel, which is titled Payers, Providers, and Employers. If you build it, will they come?
Thanks, Shira, and good morning, everybody. As Shira said, I'm Jeff Saunders. I have a number of roles in my life. One of them is of counsel at Dorsey & Whitney. I'm also involved with a couple of digital health emerging growth companies as well. But I won't spend as much time on me. I want to introduce our great panelists, three people who I've had the good fortune to have met over the past couple of years. And I'll ask each of them to give you a little bit of their background so you can set the stage in terms of what perspectives they're going to bring to the discussion today. We're going to do it as a more informal fireside chat. We're not going to have a slide presentation. I noticed that there's no fire, but I've been asked not to set fire to anything. So I'm going to go from my left. First, Charlie Montreal with Best Buy.
Good.
Go ahead, Charlie.
Hi.
Give some.
Charlie Montreal with Best Buy. I'm Senior Vice President in Human Resources. I'm in charge of Total Rewards, which is compensation, benefits, HR technology, and payroll. I've worked at Best Buy for 11 years. Prior to that, I was with Carlson Companies, which most of you know in town, which had TGI Fridays Restaurants, Radisson Hotels, Carlson Wagenly Travel at the time. And I was chair of the Buyers Healthcare Action Group here in town for about 10 years during the heyday of the patient choice model that we had in town. And that's it.
Next is Kevin OLeary with Allina Health.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. Head of Innovation for Allina Health, been at Allina 2 years. I oversee our venture capital investments, a technology transfer function that we have developing internal IP, and then strategically aligned innovation initiatives, so helping bring in outside innovation from digital health startups and others inside of Allina Health. So been there 2 years now. Prior to that was at United Health Group for a startup they had called Harken Health, running strategy, population health, data analytics for that organization. Had my own digital health startup before that in the heart failure remote monitoring space. Happy to be here.
And finally, Brooks Dybel with Holmes Murphy.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. Brooks Dybel. I lead the employee benefits, the regional employee benefits brokerage consulting practice for Holmes Murphy, based in Minneapolis. Just started that role in early July of this year. Prior to that, I spent the previous 6 years at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota, where I led their commercial markets business. And then prior to my experience with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota, I spent 10 years with United Healthcare.
Thanks. Let's dive in. Maybe just to set the stage, it would be great to hear from each of you on, how you're viewing, either the cornucopia or fire hose of digital health offerings. I mean, there's just been an explosion of vendors in the marketplace, and I'd be interested in hearing how people are approaching you, how you deal with the torrent of approaches. Just at a high level, and then we'll dive deeper into how you spec things out, how you vet, etc.
Okay. Well, I'll start out. Of course, the internet is an easy way in which you get to us. We get flooded every day, the beginning, middle, and end of the day, with new and innovative approaches to healthcare, to mental well-being, to financial well-being. And it is a bit overwhelming to decide where you put your time, energy, and effort. So where we look at starting filtering this out is, first and foremost, we have other colleagues in town, so my compatriots, who other employers are using, what emerging trends there are. We learn this by being on other association groups, by going to conferences. Those are great ways to hear about innovation. But first and foremost, for Best Buy and a number of major Fortune 100 companies, we've banded together to create an organization called the Employer Health Innovation Roundtable. And if you're not familiar with EHIR, you should look it up and get familiar, because if you've got a product that you want to come to market, every 6 months about the top 20 Fortune 100 companies in this country band together. We filter through about 40 or 50 applicants. We take the top 10, and then we'll spend 2.5 days looking at these emerging products, these emerging ideas. We'll have presentations. 99% of the time, 2 or 3 or 4 companies will then adopt one of these vendors and agree to talk to them more, try them out, beta test, and then we come back later, about a year later, and then test and debrief whether the product had legs or not. This is a great way to get exposure and a great way to beta test. I tell you, the one way to the death knell, go above me to the CEO and the head of HR, and then send me an email that says, hey, and I met your CEO and she said to send you this email and take a look at our product. That's pretty much dead on arrival.
I was just going to ask you that.
So interestingly, that works fairly well inside of Alina these days. Being in the health system 18 months, one of the things I've heard repeatedly, in health systems I think get a bad rap for being slow to adopt new innovative technologies. And I don't think that's quite a fair statement. I actually think we can adopt things pretty quickly. We're just a very decentralized organization that does so in a small pocket. And when you try to scale it across the organization, we really struggle to do anything meaningful. So we, in essence, have crowded ourselves out of doing meaningful innovation. So one of the things that we've been doing over the last 18 months is putting in place a more centralized process to try to implement innovation in a more standardized way. So like Charlie, we've been participating up front in a variety of groups industry-wide, trying to help us source ideas better. So there's a group of health systems trying to innovate together, participating with an organization called Avia. So we participate there. They help us source ideas. Our various venture capital partners, so we've invested in 4 venture capital groups, all roughly speaking in the digital health space with the intent of having them help us source ideas. They serve as our primary sourcing gate up front, and then we also have all of our internal operators and clinicians who are out talking, attending industry conferences, learning about ideas. And then we run it through a process where we put together a 2-pager that's an initial sniff test that we run by an internal group inside the organization of clinical folks, operational folks, legal, compliance, IT, finance, and strategy, intending to get the initial organizational read of it. We do an initial implementation to try to understand whether or not product's working, whether or not we're ready for rollout, and then ultimately we scale it from there. So that's the process we've been putting in place with the intent of trying to pick a more select few innovation areas that we want to intentionally prioritize organizationally so we can get out of the space of we work with a ton of different startups and really small pilots, and none of them are that meaningful because we can't organizationally figure out how to get behind something.
Brooks, you've got kind of a unique perspective. You spent a lot of time on the payer side, and I know you got approached by a number of vendors in that context, and now you're looking at bringing solutions out to your clients.
Yeah, so spending the last 6 years at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota before I joined Holmes Murphy, most point solutions vendors in this space are looking to partner with various Blue plans. So we had a lot of interest in partnering with Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota. And generally our approach there, and I think it's very similar to the approach we take at Holmes Murphy, is if we see an unmet need in the marketplace, right? If our clients are clamoring for something that as an organization we don't have a solution for today, we'll scour the market, or we're more willing to take a particular meeting. Generally speaking, if it's another Me Too solution, either thinking about my previous role or the role I filled today, there's less interest in meeting with those type of organizations. If it's a solution that already exists in the marketplace and it's just building off what ultimately exists today, but I'm less inclined to look at things like ROI because I think it's hard to wrap your arms around ROI at times, and ROI is sometimes not overly believable. So I'm more focused, and we've been more focused on looking at clinical outcomes. So do you have data that goes back over a period of time that show that you've reduced the prevalence of a specific disease within your population, that you've improved engagement, and it's an engagement number that we can agree on, an engagement methodology that ultimately makes sense. So it's being able to prove that there's clinical data to back up the solution ultimately. And then lastly, I think one of the other big things too that I think a lot of times people don't spend enough time thinking about is it easy to integrate with the employer, or is it easy to integrate with the TPA or the carrier that you're working with? Because ultimately, you can have the best solution available in a particular space, but if the integration period is 9 months or 12 months and it's going to cost the carrier or the employer or whoever it might be $1 million to make that integration, that's going to be a barrier to ultimately getting the solution off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, what would you say are the top pain points that your clients are looking to solve for?
There's a couple of things. I mean, first goes to the integration point is the solutions they're bringing to market need to make sense to them as an employer in terms of their total package, in terms of what they're offering, but it's also got to be connected from a member standpoint, because I think we've actually got a little bit of fatigue within some employee populations because there are so many point solutions out there, and employees and their family members now have 6 mobile apps related to different health-related areas on their mobile phone, and they've gotten to a point where they've ultimately checked out. So, from an employer standpoint, they're looking for somebody that can connect the experience both for them as an employer, but also for their employees and their family members, and that just doesn't exist today. There's been a lot of solutions that have come to market that have signaled that they'd be able to solve for that. But I think ultimately, if you really look at it, there's nobody that's out there that's providing that integrated experience, pulling together various different solutions.
Going back to your days at Blue Cross and United, are there payers that are trying to build that themselves, or are they looking for a vendor to bring that forward?
I think all of the payers are trying to solve that in one way or another. Right now, everyone's fighting to be the aggregator, right? Whether it's Ben Admin HRIS, private exchange, whether it's health and well-being or engagement platform, or whether it's the payer. So I think everyone's trying to figure out a way to solve for that, but nobody has cracked the code yet on how to make that happen. I know from the payer standpoint, the payers are very focused on, they want to own the relationship. They want to be the person ultimately that the member is coming to and looking for resources. When you start moving things out like customer service, when you start moving things out like case management, disease management, all of those things, they lose control. And now their value comes in as simply a claims payer and a network that they're providing. And I can assure you that that's not what payers are looking for.
How about you, Kevin? Your organization has a different spot in the healthcare spectrum or supply chain. What are the key things that Allina is trying to solve for right now?
So from a strategic perspective, we're looking at a few spaces, and I think we're fairly similar to most health systems in that. One, we're looking at consumerism. 2, we're looking at how we rethink our front door and how consumers are potentially going to access health system services in the future. We're looking at automating our back office to make that more efficient. And then we're looking at this, call it pathway to value, how we move to more risk-based contracts as an organization. Those would be strategically problem areas we're trying to solve, where we're trying to advance our organizational thinking. Within that, I think that all stems from a few drivers. 1, we know we need to be more convenient for how people are going to access care in the future. 2, we know we need to lower the cost infrastructure that we've built up over time to deliver care at lower costs. And 3, we need to do it in a sustainable way for our employee base. Provider burnout's a huge issue for us. We've got an aging physician population, and we need to start thinking about how we address that. So solutions that can get at those 3 pain points while solving those strategic initiatives for us are really where we're spending our time as an organization.
How about at Best Buy, Charlie?
Well, first, I think we start with we have gone down the path. We've hit a brick wall. The costs are going up. Medical inflation is going up at 10%. We have changed copays. We've added deductibles. We've added co-insurance. We've taken away healthcare coverage, and we've got a population that on average makes $13.86 an hour. And so the company, it's becoming unsustainable for us to keep doing what we're doing. And so we're looking to our providers, we're looking to our administrators to bring that innovation. We believe that digital technology is the savior for us as an organization. We have a very tech-savvy population, but being able to get the right care at the right price, at the right place, is fundamental to what we're trying to accomplish. So the more we can get remote monitoring, the more that we can have people have their care via video and stay in their home, the more that we can get employees to understand the true cost of their health care at the point of purchase is really key to us. When we look at, we've expanded the definition of what we consider well-being in healthcare. Mental well-being is as important to us as healthcare right now. It is the unspoken killer of employees. But I'll tell you what, as of today, we know that 10% to 15% of our population has some form of clinical depression, and they're coming into work. And we know that technical solutions and digital solutions are there to help us drive a better and healthier population.
So let's spend a little bit more time on that. How often have you seen a digital solution really move the needle on whether it's mental health or a particular chronic disease? Are you seeing solutions in the marketplace that you have any confidence level in?
It's a good question. So there's a couple things. It's inconsistent, but there are some solutions out there that are working. When we look at mental well-being, for example, we're in the very early stages of marrying artificial intelligence with technology to get people the help. The stigma on mental health is so great, people won't talk about it. I'll talk about, my God, I drink too much beer and my big toe hurts, and boy, my uric acid level is such and such, but boy, I will not talk to you about my 36-year-old son who couldn't sit up here because of the anxiety he feels. But artificial intelligence in the mental well-being space is available, and we have to start reducing the stigma. At the same time, if people aren't comfortable about it, we give them a vehicle to use that can help channel care to them. So I think we are changing the needle, and corporate America is going to get on board with that kind of product. Where you're talking about chronic disease, there's so many solutions out there, and I think these guys pointed it out. Landing on a solution that works with the employee and the provider and the claims payer and the disease management and the doctor is really difficult. And so you can have my chronic disease goes to the doctor, goes to the clinic. Then I tell them, oh, by the way, use this digital piece to help you. But none of that data is getting to the doctor. None of that data, and I'm paying our provider disease management fees. So I don't know what's moving the needle on digital in that space. And so being able to break through that and coordinate that is incredibly important to us. But I think there are things that are working, and some are in the early stages and require us to collaborate and bust through those things.
How are you thinking about measuring real engagement? You talked about AI, and anecdotally, it seems to me that people respond more reluctantly to dealing with a robot long term than they do, dealing with a human being, their doctor or a care coordinator. And I want to ask this question to all of you, but let's start with you, Charlie. How somebody can open an app, but that's not real engagement. It's what behavior change is that app driving?
If I've got someone who's in need and they are reluctant to talk to somebody about it, to be able to, and these kids are tech savvy, they're used to going. We can't think like baby boomers. These kids are very comfortable going to technology. Artificial intelligence can just help them channel to what might be ailing them. And I'll tell you, ultimately, it's the stories they tell. It's the email that comes back to the head of HR. Thank you for opening up and making this product available. I went into it. I went through it. I really self-reflected. I went to treatment. I was ready to commit suicide. I'm back. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's that cultural aspect, those stories that get told, that I think are the true measures in this space. You're never going to be able to, how many suicides did I prevent by having this in place? You're never going to be able to measure that. But the cultural change and the, hey, it's okay to talk about it, that drives that conversation. It's a great investment.
How about, same question to you, Kevin?
Yep. I think for us, every implementation is going to be different across mental health, diabetes, whatever space, but it starts off with process metrics that you're measuring along the way, and then ultimately, hopefully, you can prove out clinical and financial outcomes metrics once you get far enough along in the use of the product. For us, a good example of this, one of the innovations that OLeary is really proud of at the moment is in the social determinants of health space, which is a really hot space for health system innovation right now. We've implemented a tool called NowPow, a little digital health startup out of Chicago, that does a social determinants of health screener. So when somebody comes into our clinic for a visit on a government payer, Medicare, or Medicaid, one of our nurses screens them for social determinants of health needs. Based on that screening, we can then connect them to services out in their community down to the zip code level. So in 2019, we're on track to screen over 200,000 patients for social determinants of health needs, which is a sizable portion of our patient population. And I think the latest stat is roughly a fourth to a third screen positive for some sort of need that we're going to meet in the community. Now, the reason why I bring that up is all of that is process metrics that you assume will lead to the right outcome for us long term because you're meeting the needs of those patients in a way that we haven't historically. We don't know yet what the clinical outcomes we're actually going to show from that are or what the financial improvement from undertaking this activity is. So right now, we're undertaking this because we've gotten a grant from the government through something called the Accountable Health Communities program, where the government's funding that for the next 5 years. When that government funding runs out, we're going to have to ask the question of how do we continue to fund this inside of our own P&L, which is going to require financial clinical outcomes that are going to make our organization want to sustain this. So we need to both do the process metrics and then also have an eye on those outcome metrics over the long term, which is certainly the harder part to prove in digital health currently.
Mm-hmm. Go a little bit deeper on that. Is there a plan right now to look at outcomes? And how are you going to do that?
Certainly, yes. We've got a team internally that's looking at both clinical outcomes in that population and then also financial outcomes for the folks in that program. So with the government and the other health systems that are partaking in that program, they're looking at trying to look at costs of that population over time, and hopefully we can show that costs decrease over the 3 to 5 years that we're going to be in that program. There's been some studies out there on social determinants of health generally that show that by addressing social determinants of health, you can reduce costs in populations. But we've got a team that's working on setting up both those clinical financial outcomes metrics as we go.
So you're not planning on running any kind of a randomized control trial? I mean, that would be extremely difficult in that context.
Yes. Yes.
Brooks, how about you? What are you seeing on how people are thinking about engagement and what you're hearing in the marketplace about actual?
Yeah, I think looking at just engagement alone doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot. To the average employer and to the average payer out there. The engagement's got to be combined with some clinical outcomes. So I think the area that's probably done the best in this space is in the area of the metabolic syndrome, so the prediabetes programs and those type of things, where they've actually been able to, their people are stepping on their scale daily, right? And you're able to report back to an employer, those vendors are able to report back to an employer to say, hey, listen, you've lost 12,000 pounds within your employee population and taken, 18 people from the pre-diabetic stage to being otherwise normal levels. And then the other areas is in the virtual health, the telehealth space, where people actually do self-report to say, if I wouldn't have gone to this particular service, I would have gone to the urgent care or the ER. And in those scenarios, you actually prove some sort of an ROI within a reasonable range in those particular areas. Where I think the big opportunity is, then you have on the total opposite end, you got just these self-service tools, and a lot of those have come from the behavioral health space that we've talked about. And it's hard to determine whether or not that engagement's having a meaningful impact. I think for us to get to where we need to be, there's an opportunity in this sort of virtual care first type model, but it's both a push and a pull. So right now it's in those self-service models, people have to go to them and engage them. They may back off for 3 months and there's nothing to really pull them back in. So I think there needs to be some element of human engagement coupled with that virtual technology that's being delivered today.
Thanks. I'm going to kind of tick through, some of the, what I think of as the obvious, selling points for a vendor coming into one of your organizations. We've talked about engagement. We've touched a little bit on outcomes. Let's talk about ROI and versus, value on investment, or, VOI. We've all seen a lot of different ways that, vendors purport to measure those things. Some are very objective based, some of them seem rather convoluted. I'd like to get everybody's perspective on, what you're seeing in the marketplace, what kind of presentation about ROI is meaningful versus, the mistakes that you see people make. So maybe we'll start again with you, Brooks.
Yeah, if you go down that path, the ROI has got to be simple for the employer to understand and for all the stakeholders to understand, and it's got to be believable, because I've seen some ROI methodologies where it feels like it would be very easy to back into the ROI that you're looking to deliver on the program. And I would just say, if your solution's going to propose a PMPM model, I think there's a little bit of fatigue around PMPM models right now. So if it is going to be in that PMPM model, it does have to be backed up with strong, outcomes-based measures and guarantees, whether that's on the clinical side or the engagement side or on the ROI side of things. I think employers are a little bit more willing to take that jump if it's some sort of a shared savings type of model. So implementation, if there's some sort of a shared savings type model on top of that, or even a claims-based model. I think part of the reason the Omadas of the world and some of the Naturally Slims and those vendors that they've gotten, the traction that they have and have been able to demonstrate that their programs are, can have a positive impact, is because they are, they're claims-based. And it's Charlie can probably attest to this. Anytime you want to go and sell the leadership added costs, right, in the form of PMPMs, that's another obstacle for you as an employer, and it's an obstacle for us as consultants as we engage with our customers.
So when you say claims-based, it isn't a separate line item in the benefits budget. It's a claim that's run through the plan.
It's an easy sell if you say, we're going to incur increased claims here, but we expect savings on the other side of it, right? And I think that's what you'd expect if you reduce the prevalence of prediabetes in your population, as an example.
How much are you seeing? How prevalent is it for vendors to be offering a completely at-risk pricing model?
It's not very prevalent at this point in time. I mean, I see a willingness to offer up to 50% or so, or even if they go beyond 50%, 50% of the metrics are layups for them to ultimately achieve. So I think when it comes down to it, you don't see a whole lot of vendors that are willing to go beyond, I would say truly beyond, 25 to 30% of the fees at risk. Once you back out the layup metrics that are incorporated into performance guarantees.
Kevin, how about your perspective on this topic?
So the health system is skeptical of ROIs across the board, I'd say, regardless of how folks come in. I think one of the interesting things reflecting on this, when we're talking about digital therapeutics in general, under the core fee-for-service model that we hospitals operate under, they hurt us from an ROI perspective because we're the costs in general that they're replacing through a lower cost digital perspective. So the ROI models that tend to come to us rely on some sort of, you got a population in ACO, you've got some sort of risk arrangement, which is a really hard model for us at the moment as a predominantly fee-for-service health system. So there's always some skepticism as to whether or not we can actually generate any ROI from the widespread adoption of these tools and whether or not they actually hurt us from a financial perspective because we have a relatively small amount of our population in, call it, at-risk type arrangements. We've got our employee health plan. That's a natural landing spot for us where we'll consider these things and, generally speaking, adopt them first. But it's really hard to roll these things out at the health system. We've got a heart failure remote monitoring solution that we have internally that I think has 40 or 50 patients on it rolled out fully across the system because we're using it in ACO populations. It's hard to get that critical mass under the fee-for-service construct. And so those sorts of models, they're just really challenging to prove an ROI inside of that construct. The more back office type functionality, you can prove out an ROI to us either by increasing fee-for-service revenue or decreasing cost functions. The easiest way to perk up our ears and get us to listen is actually just sending us the Excel file of the model that you are running that ROI with. Like, just give us the numbers of how much you're going to try to reduce headcount or something like that, because our internal team's already going to have a perspective on that answer. So you coming and saying the ROI is whatever percent, we're not going to listen to that. We're going to want to run that number ourselves. So just getting access to the data and then being able to assess that as a team is the fastest way to answer that question for us internally. But we can, either increasing revenue in that fee-for-service world or reducing headcount, and that often comes in the way of not increasing future headcount rather than reducing existing headcount, because nobody wants to talk about the latter in that scenario, but we are willing to consider the former, where prior auth automation is a good example of this. Right now, we have a challenge with payers in that prior auths are reducing our revenue as a system. Our answer today is to throw people at trying to get more prior auths through. You could theoretically use AI to automate that process, make it more seamless, and then we don't have to hire those folks. That's cost savings for us. That's a fairly clear ROI in the fee-for-service world for a health system. So to some extent, it depends on what type of product you're evaluating, but that's how we think about it.
Well, Charlie, let me amend my question a little bit. I want to focus more on this concept of value on investment. How you're on the front lines of looking at the impact of benefit structures on a really large employee population, and a lot of those folks are the you call them the blue shirts on the floor. Is that kind of presenteeism, the cultural piece that you made reference to earlier? How important are those in as evaluation criteria when you're looking at solutions?
For us, it's the ultimate criteria is customer satisfaction. It's measuring the love of our customers for our brand. So everything we do, whether it be in healthcare, whether it be in caregiving, anything we do on the benefit and compensation side, ultimately has to translate into brand love for the customer. So investing in the employee, who comes engaged into the workplace, who feels good, has a great state of mental and physical well-being is incredibly important to us. So when we look at putting solutions in front, I agree with everything these guys said. People, if I added up all the return on investment that I've been promised over the years, we would be the profit center. We wouldn't need bricks and mortar, technology solutions because I'm the profit center. And we know that's not true. And so, especially in the startup digital space, yes, we have to go to the chief financial officer and the CEO, but we also understand under-promise, over-deliver, stop focusing so much on return on investment. If it's a good idea, we want to beta test it. Let's experiment with it. Most of the time, you guys don't have 6 years of Medtronic, United Healthcare, Best Buy, General Mills data to come to me and say, look at what we've proven. You've got a theory that you're working with. You've got some reason that you believe there's return, but let's get out there and beta test. Let's see. Let's establish the base. Let's get the solution in. Let's try it. Let's fail fast and revise and keep going. But if we don't, so ultimately, though, these solutions have got to sell us that the blue shirts in the store are going to be better off, and they're going to take care of our customers.
We've sort of skirted around this or touched on the internal sale process. So shifting gears a little bit, I'd like to talk about what the gauntlet is that a vendor has to run through, and it's not just selling each of you. There are other constituents that weigh in from a lot of different perspectives. So I think it'd be great if you could share with the audience, your internal process and the hurdles that have to be cleared.
Yeah, for a small startup in the digital space, it's akin to climbing Mount Everest, and I'm the Sherpa, because I believe in the idea and I want to help you climb the mountain, but you've got this thing called procurement, you've got legal, you've got finance, you've got IT, and everyone plays a role in this. Our risk management people are, and they apply their craft to big companies. We battle with Sony, with Microsoft, with Samsung, and so our processes and our filtering system is built on heavyweights going at it to determine the contract. Small startups that we want to experiment with, they apply these same kind of filters to, and they have to start altering. What do you mean they can't afford this amount of insurance? That's standard practice for us. What's this thing called HIPAA? Can they satisfy us over HIPAA? We need integration. We want 100% of their fees at risk. Other companies do that. Well, it's not possible to do that. So I find myself advocating on behalf of the digital provider to get through the system. But there's reasons for this. One, I'll tell you what, most of our data, of our startup digital providers, they learn along the way. We teach them how they have to make sales to other employers. And I'll tell you what, one data breach at Best Buy from you having our social security numbers or data on our employees, and it ain't gonna matter how great your product was for the organization, I'm gonna be held accountable for that $50 million data breach. So there's reasons why we put this stuff in play, but it is not an easy journey.
Likewise. So the Alina process in general, as I was mentioning earlier, we've built this cross-functional team to try to be the team that helps move ideas through the organization. And we've intentionally brought in legal, compliance, digital, operations, clinical, finance into that group, because those are the key stakeholders who are going to either help move things along or be the roadblocks in the process. Our two biggest hurdles internally, There's a technology review, and as part of that technology review, there's a security risk assessment and there's a privacy assessment. Those two assessments for early stage digital health startups are often really hard for the exact reasons that Charlie's mentioning. Signing a BAA, what levels of insurance, how they're protecting our patient data. These are all really meaty questions for us that we've got to think about at the aggregate of our 1 million patients across Minnesota, and it's oftentimes hard for early stage startups to meet those requirements. And so then it becomes a process of working through how we come together and try to find a way to collaborate and move past that. So that team takes an idea from a clinical champion or operating champion. So that's the key first step for us as an organization. If we don't have that, we're not going to try to move it forward because we think that's getting it in the hands of somebody who wants to take the project forward and be successful with it is a critical part for us. So we'll help them through that. And then we've got a senior executive committee, that's most of our executive leadership team, that meets once a month to evaluate where projects are at, how to help them get unstuck and move key projects forward through the organization. So between that working group and that executive group, that's how we try to move these things forward through OLeary.
Kevin, can you talk a little bit more about the clinical perspective in that process? For patient-facing digital solutions, it's there are a lot of different ways to design a solution that fits seamlessly, easily into a clinician's workflow, and then there are ways that make it dead on arrival. Yes. Do you have any observations, tips along those lines?
So it's hard. It happens on a case-by-case basis. It's dependent on the clinician and their mindset on this digital shift, and oftentimes where they're at in their career plays a big role in that. In general, I think there's two approaches to this. So I see interesting care delivery innovation happening across care model innovation, payment model innovation, and technology stack innovation. And there's a lot of startups that come to us pitching all three of those wrapped up into one, which I would call this new idea of full stack care delivery startups. Those are harder for our clinicians to wrap their heads around because they're essentially pitching a replacement of the health system. So a lot of the digital tools that are out there are saying, hey, employer, work with us as a lower cost alternative to the health system. And it's hard for our clinicians to wrap their heads around that because oftentimes they're offering the same sort of diabetes educators or sets of services that we are offering, just digitally, virtually, et cetera. And that's hard for our clinicians to wrap their heads around. And I would say oftentimes those startups should be pitching health systems employee plans as a customer, but shouldn't really be thinking about us as a early partner until they get enough employers using them to come back to us and say, hey, we're driving a meaningful book of business for you to be thinking about. Use us as an avenue in for this patient population. There's then the other way of addressing it, which is instead of trying to solve the care model yourselves, you try to solve the technology yourselves and fit into provider workflow so that we can use the technology to drive the same sort of digital change that's happening in the industry. That we open our ears to because we're the care model experts in that scenario, and that fits into our kind of mental model of how we view the world as a health system. So that pitch is much easier for us to hear. You then get into a whole other can of worms of fitting into provider workflow with Epic and things like that, needing to be integrated into Epic and how long that takes, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a bit of a catch-22. Those are the two ways that I see pitches generally going. For us as a health system to hear it, you for sure want to be pitching the tech that can fit into our workflow and have a good answer to how it fits in from a data integration perspective, so on and so forth.
Brooks, if you don't mind, would you talk a little bit about the payer world?
Absolutely. So, a lot of what they have talked about already in terms of the overall vetting process and some of the legal and security concerns ring true on the payer side as well. But I mean, generally speaking, from a payer standpoint, the payer is looking at it to say, is it going to help me either lower my healthcare costs within my fully insured population, whether that's fully insured commercial, Medicare, or Medicaid, or is it going to help me sell more business and increase my membership? Is it going to help me improve my STARS rating? Whatever it might be within that population where the payer is actually taking risk on the membership. In the self-insured space, which I think that's in a lot of ways that's where the startup digital health companies get their traction. It comes down to, does it fill an unmet need that we don't have today, and is it something that our customers are clamoring for? Candidly, many times when a payer elects to partner with a digital health solution, it's because they've been pressured by either the broker or consultant community or by their customers that want that. They may resist it as long as they possibly can until they know that they're at risk of potentially losing that client as a customer, and ultimately they'll make that decision at the last minute. The other thing that the payers are generally doing is they're looking at and they're going through a process of, buy, build, or partner. So as they look at a particular solution, they may say, all right, well, is this something we should be considering purchasing, or purchasing something similar, right? Or is this something we could build internally and something that we could take advantage of, building something of similar capabilities, or ultimately partner? Is there an opportunity where it could be a strategic partnership, or simply a partnership where we're just exchanging data and playing together nicely in the sandbox?
In the minutes that we have left, I think maybe it would be helpful for the audience to hear some of the worst, basically, cautionary tales without, disclosing, names, but, Charlie, you mentioned, one way to be dead on arrival is to have this.
I was kidding. For those of you that know my CEO,
press for you to meet with somebody. But are there other cautionary tales that you can share?
well, I think so often we see promises that you so want to make the sale, you overpromise, and then once we're interested, slowly but surely, the reality sets in and the expectations go down, and then it's not a good feeling for anybody. And so really coming in realistically, what you're trying to do, what your good idea is, with realistic expectations, you have a lot more credibility with us and our team, because we're the guys who get egg on our face if it doesn't perform the way that we expect it to. And we're the guys that answer back to senior management. So I would say that's the biggest thing that we see.
Thanks. Kevin?
2 points. So one, being overly aggressive in the sales process with our employees can be a challenge in that I think if you're a digital health startup trying to sell to a health system these days, you've got to cast a really wide net and expect a really long sales cycle from the perspective of it needs to hit the right strategic planning cycle to have that startup come up in conversation for an employee internally. And so one of the most common conversations I'll have with a startup is I'll get introduced through an advisor we have who says, hey, I've got this startup who was having great conversations with Alina, and then all of a sudden Alina went dead. Can you figure out what's going on inside the organization? And almost every single time that happens, we had an employee, an operator, a clinician who was interested in the startup personally, was trying to figure out a landing spot for it in their budget cycle, what have you, and couldn't do it. And they didn't have the time to bring it up with their boss because they got a lot of stuff on their plate, and so the conversation died, and that employee didn't really know how to say that back to the startup, so they just let it simmer. If startup keeps coming at that employee immediately turns off, won't respond anymore, that relationship is then dead inside of Alina for all intents and purposes. If instead you take the slow approach and realize that it's just going to take a while to get in one of these health systems and you've got to go wide and let those relationships develop over time, that can be a much more successful approach to building those relationships. So that would be one side of it. Point two would be we see a lot of digital health startups with a land and expand type sales strategy. So they want to get a small pilot inside of Alina, and they've got this host of other services that they can then expand to from there. There have been a couple instances where they land with a small pilot with a group inside of one of our hospitals. Our executive team has no idea that the pilot's ongoing because it just hasn't risen to that level of priority for the organization, and that team then kills the pilot. because of lack of budget, lack of time, what have you. So there have been a few startups that have gotten in and then been kicked out of the organization, and that's presented some real challenges in those regards. So point there being, as you build a relationship with the health system, making sure that you get executive level involvement early on to figure out whether or not it's a true strategic priority for the organization. That will help suss out whether or not you have a chance of developing meaningful relationship at that point in time.
How about you, Brooks?
A couple things I'd add. Sometimes I've noticed that in this space there's a lack of flexibility, meaning you start engaging with the payer, with the customer, and the customer would like a tweak to how something is offered, or there's clear evidence that you should be pivoting from a strategy standpoint, but you're so married to what you've created that ultimately it becomes your the downfall. So I think exhibiting flexibility and not being so rigid in terms of how it's offered either to the payer or ultimately to the customer. The other thing is that I would say is I totally agree with overpromise, delivering what Charlie had talked about, but I also see a tendency towards stopping the investments once the sales have been made. And I think far too often there's this belief that really some of these digital startups are just trying to get to a point of being acquired, and they go through a period of time where they're not making the necessary investments to continue to advance the solution, which ultimately has a negative impact longer term. And then the last thing I'd say is a lot of times there's just not an understanding of how to price this. When you get into this space, either you've grossly underpriced the product or grossly overpriced the product, which can have longer term implications.
Great. Well, we're running up against the 5-minute mark, so I'd like to open up for questions. Yes, go ahead.
What do you think the perspective is in the market for digital health solutions based in virtual assistant platforms like Alexa? Are people really excited about that? Are they nervous about it? What are you seeing out there?
So the question is, what are you seeing with respect to introducing digital assistants?
Mm-hmm. We're a real believer in it. In fact, Best Buy is expanding into the healthcare marketplace into senior health, and so digital monitoring equipment, the ability for me to sit here at Best Buy headquarters, my mom and dad in their 80s in St. Cloud, to know that if my mom goes downstairs to do the wash and she doesn't come up in 2 hours, that I get alerted, hey, mom's down in the basement, you might want to check on her. She did fall in the basement and cracked her pelvis about 2 years ago. My dad was out in the garage, didn't hear her for 2 hours, and had to call the ambulance. Now, with a bot downstairs, she just goes, call 911 or call Charlie or call the ambulance, and it's there. So this remote monitoring, the ability to give us peace of mind that our parents are well taken care of, it's huge. It's a huge, huge piece.
We're really excited about it organizationally. I think we've got a lot of tests underway. We struggle with it's one of these spaces that's really exciting with a lot of cool technology, but the business case, we have no idea what that is yet. But from a consumerism perspective, we've got teams building out and testing out Alexa skills, et cetera. So we've got work underway there. And then interestingly, actually in hospital rooms, so like we've got a rehab facility in Golden Valley for people who are recovering from major spinal cord injuries who are in a hospital bed who can't get out of bed. We've got an Alexa sitting right next to them so they can call the nurse, they can change TV channels, et cetera. So those actually have meaningful impacts on patient experience, and I think where you'll see health systems start adopting those tools first, but certainly we're very excited about the consumerism change that it presents on the horizon.
Yeah, I would agree with what these guys have said. I think there's a lot of opportunity in that particular space. I think there's an opportunity there to connect with the self-service tools that exist today, and having some both push and pull communication with members, particularly in their homes.
Thanks. Time for one quick question, please. I was getting the wrap-up music silently from the back, but let's take one more question.
I'm sorry. I I see the traditional triumvirate up here of employers and payers and providers. Do you see an outside disruptor, a bigger force becoming that aggregator that you're all saying is not really coming together within any of your three silos at this point? You know, a Microsoft or something like that stepping in and taking it over.
I think there's absolutely potential for that, particularly when you think about the fact that if there gets to a point where there's less variation in payments, right, where the provider contracting isn't as important as we move forward, which I think there's some real potential for that, right, where you're not looking at, employers aren't simply looking at discounts and contracted rates and those type of things. So I think particularly if there's less variation in discounts and contracted rates, and if there's more alternate care delivery models that are incorporated into into the system, I think there is absolutely opportunity to that. Because then you start looking at what exists today and being able to take the best in class from various areas and be able to integrate that into a seamless experience for the employer and the member. That's I think it's a real possibility.
And I would also add, there are the providers, or I'm sorry, the payers, I think, have their eyes on companies like Accolade, Quantum, maybe Castlight, Jiff, as, rising aggregators. Other perspectives?
I could see Walmart very quickly changing rural healthcare in this country almost overnight if they bought a payer and started rolling out this clinical model that they're testing in Georgia. I think they've got a huge opportunity to do that in rural America, and then once they do that, the world's, I think, their oyster at that point. So I personally am very interested to see where they go in this space, and you've got all your other disruptors too who might pull it off, but Walmart's got my attention.
I would agree with that. I think Walmart has great potential. I think the others, they're all working on it. I think data is king. Where you're seeing the huge fight right now is who owns the data. And do we own our data? Does United Healthcare own our data? Do the digital players own? And so we're in our contracting, we are really, really trying to protect that piece of it, because still in this country, the large employers have so much of the data, and they're key to pulling anything off, I think, at this point.
Well, at risk of my own life, I'm going to have to wrap it up here. So I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists today.